Okay, so welcome to week 3. I don't know about you guys, but I feel like things are sort of rapidly starting to speed up now. Week 1 went quite slowly, and now I seem to be at the end of week 3 already, and I'm going, oh my God, I've got all this marking coming in. So this week we're really focused on trying to start to prepare our project plan. So we're really focusing on that assessment task, which is due in week 5, and starting to put that together and see what that looks like. Now, your project plan is not set in stone, even once you've handed in your week 5 assessment item. It's always going to be a work in progress because you never know when you're researching or when you're drafting whether you might suddenly take a different viewpoint, or you find something that leads you slightly on a different path to what you were on originally. So please be flexible and don't feel like if you hand something in at week 5 that's it, you've got to follow that to the letter. And of course, I'll be providing you with feedback on your project plan anyway, so you might want to make some adaptations to what you're writing about in light of the feedback that you receive as well. Having said that, it's a really important part of the process to start trying to plan what the final project might look like, what kind of headings you'll use, what kind of sources you're going to use, what you found out so far. It's really important to try and bring that together at this stage, and then think about time planning as well, because if you create a plan or a structure, you might not stick to it every week and it might not go perfectly. We all have life get in the way of things, but it's something that you can come back to draw yourself back in and start over when you've had a bad day or a bad couple of weeks and you haven't been able to do as much as you hoped or anticipated. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping things before we kick off. I just want to remind you guys that Census Day is the 4th of August, which is next week. So if you are thinking about withdrawing from this unit, please feel free to get in touch and we can talk about what your options are. If you're feeling uncomfortable with your topic or the assessment, then perhaps have a chat through with me first before you make that final decision. Also note that there's lots of support services you can also try as well if you do want some help with certain aspects of your life, and note that I'm here to help anyway. So if you just want a general chat, please feel free to get in touch pre or post census date. Also, only a few of you have posted your research topics on the Microsoft Teams forum or the research topics forum in the Moodle site. Please do so. There's nothing dangerous about doing that. It's really so that you can find like-minded people who are on a similar topic, so that you can share resources, bounce ideas off each other, and really build up a sort of understanding of the area, which is much easier to do when you are chatting with others about it. The more that you can exchange information, the more it helps you process the information and understand what you're going to do with it. So it's a really good idea to just post your research topic. It doesn't have to be the question or the statement. It can just be the broad area that you're looking at. And then maybe, who knows, the people who are working on similar topics might be able to help you refine that topic a little bit if you are struggling. Okay, so how did everyone go with the research project plan that you were asked to do for the workshop this week? Kat says she's done hers. That's good, Kat. You've done a lot of work towards your project anyway with your mind mapping. So Kat's found that actually mind mapping has really helped her process her thoughts, and has got a really elaborate one that she's posted on, I think it's Microsoft Teams. Who else wants to talk about their project plan and things that you struggled with, things that you found quite easy to sort out? What do we think? Okay, we've got a comment. Had a great chat with the librarian today. Presumably that's looking at the kinds of sources, using the databases, some of the databases that you're not familiar with. Wendy says lots of notes, need to put it in some order. That's fine. it's only now that you're starting to learn a little bit about the topic that you can start to process how you might discuss the material and what the most logical or sensible way to present that information is. Amy Lee, still have lots more to do on mine. Okay, though, that's fine also. I mean, that's why it might be a good idea to find like-minded people to bounce ideas off. Or Portia, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, sorry, I just joined and I haven't muted yet.
That's okay. No worries.
Sorry.
That's okay. So quite a few of you have still said you've got a bit to do on yours. Okay, so what was the most difficult part of the project plan, do you think? Motivation to get started. That's that white page issue, I think. Yeah, I completely understand that. I think some of it, though, is a little bit routine. So maybe start with those bits first. Okay, so it might be too difficult to work out what order you're going to have your discussions, but you can just get your sources and list them on the page for a start and do a summary of what those sources say, the ones that you've read so far. Because then once it's on the page, you can then start to just move it around and see what it looks like. So sometimes just starting with the very basics can help. Or maybe start with your time plan and work out how many weeks you've got left, how much time you've got per week, and then think about where you need to be for each of your particular stages in the project process. So yeah, just start with the basics. Sometimes when I get up on a Monday and I don't really feel like doing work, I'll start with emails just because, you know, I can answer those off the top of my head and it just gets me into that frame of mind of working when I don't really want to do it. What does Kat say here? Too many resources for schools with not enough definite answers as to their policies. Policies are based on a framework in which schools develop individually. There's no stats on how cyberbullying is recorded by schools. So that's really interesting. So, I mean, that's something that even though it's a problem as you're engaging in the research process, you've gone, oh, right, the stats aren't consistently recorded. It means I can't do comparisons. It's also something that you can write about in the project itself. We can't understand we know that there's a problem, but we can't fully appreciate the depth or the breadth of the problem because of the way that the data is collected. So, Kat, I don't think that's going to actually present a problem. It probably doesn't give you everything that you wanted to support what you're saying, but it does help you identify that there's a problem and they've not got sufficient resources around measuring the problem and analysing the problem. And yes, it supports your argument of setting up a tribunal for cyberbullying. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so in terms of the project plan, I thought I would just very quickly go through some basics. Now, most of this appears in the study guide anyway, so I'm not telling you anything amazing, but I just thought I'd talk you through it a little bit. So here you can see, let me just go to full view. So here you can see that we've got the project plan and it's split into two parts. So we've got part A, and I'm just going to go back because that's not helping me see things properly, sorry. So we've got part A and we've got part B. Now part A is the project analysis. So that's really looking at what you're going to talk about, how you're going to talk about it, what sources you've got in support. It's really the actual essay. So that is setting out what it's going to look like, the essay. Part B is how you're going to get there. So it's the schedule. It's what searches you're going to do and how you're going to do them, and the organization and storage of the information that you collect. So part B is the practical, how you're going to get there. Part A is the thing that you actually produce. Now, the word limit, as you'll see on the assessment tab in the Moodle site, is 1,000 words. That's the word limit. But 2 pages is probably sufficient. You could have part A on one page and part B on another page. Okay, so don't feel like you have to get really close to 1,000 words. It depends on you know, where you're at with your project and how much information you've got so far, what you've got to find out, and you know, how many different key things you need to discuss. So each person's project plan is going to look quite different. In terms of what a project plan looks like, there's no standard format. I just wanted to make you guys aware that you're not going to lose marks for not having a standard format. It obviously needs to look professional. It needs to not have typos. It needs to be set out clearly and concisely, but it doesn't have to look a particular way. If you go to the assessments area in the Moodle site, and by that I mean the drop-down menus, not the navigation bar at the top. If you go to the drop-down menus, you'll see that there's a 2018 examples folder in that assessment area. There are some project plans in there for you to look at, and the thing that you'll see that they all have in common is that they're all completely different. So I'd want you to not stress about the format, whatever works for you. You can tailor it to suit your project, but there are some key things that you really need to include, because otherwise it's not really a good enough plan for you to work from when you're starting to draft your essay. So the first is you need to identify the problem or issue that you're addressing. So, and that's really for my purposes, so that I can see what you're intending to cover. So you need a summary, and it needs to be relatively short as to what is the key issue that you are addressing, or the key problem that you're addressing, and also a very short summary of your core argument. So it could be, for example, that facial recognition software is acceptable in public venues where there are mass people, but should otherwise be banned. So in other words, you're saying ordinarily facial recognition software should be banned, except where it's for, you know, law enforcement, but also public safety concerns. That might be your key argument. Or it could be that a CCTV recording in schools is necessary in light of bullying problems, or whatever it happens to be. I'm just picking on some topics that I've spoken about recently with specific students. So identify the problem as well as that core argument. So the problem is cyberbullying, the problem is elder abuse, and then your core argument. Now at this point, if you're able to, it's a really good idea to provide context in a summary there as well. So don't write it like it's your essay and give me 5 paragraphs, but a summary of the context is a really good idea. So just to give you an example, if you were looking at elder abuse and the use of surveillance to identify elder abuse, you'd want to identify statistics that show that it's a significant problem. Now, you might not have those yet, so you could just put in brackets to collect this. So the statistics to show it's a significant problem. Note that it's often undetected because elderly people could be senile, or there are a number of people who have contact with that elderly person, and therefore it's not possible to ascertain who is doing the abusing of the elderly person. It's also a problem because a lot of elderly care is provided in private premises, so it's not regulated in the same way as you would if you went to hospital, for example. And of course, a care provider or manager might be unwilling to deal with or address or investigate particular allegations, and that led to a number of people, which have been reported in the press, a number of people using covert recording devices to identify whether the abuse is occurring, and if so, who's doing it. But those individuals then faced prosecution for using these covert recording devices. And so here is the problem, that we've got public interest in finding out that this abuse is going on in care homes. We've got a safety issue for the residents of those homes, versus the fact that the workers who aren't doing any harm have a right to go about their work in privacy. The elderly people who are being surveyed, who are subject to the surveillance, and it may include several other people, not just the person who is suspected to have been abused, they will also possibly feature in those recordings as well. So you're balancing that privacy interest against, and the fact that it's in a private venue as well, against all of those public concerns. So that would be, 3 to 6 sentences providing the context. Again, if you don't have all of those sources available yet, you can just put to find data or to find sources on this, but you're setting the context up, which helps me understand where you're going with the project. Now, as I've already said, you need to summarize your core argument. What's the main point that will come out of your essay? Now, some of you might not have decided yet. You might be doing a pros and cons, and you're kind of on the fence and you're waiting to see what the sources come out as, in which case state what you're investigating rather than what your core argument is. But it needs to be something that, I think Scott talks about it in terms of, could I write it on a post-it note? Or think about it in terms of, if your parents or your siblings or your friends who don't study law asked you what your big research topic was, could you summarize it for them in 1 or 2 sentences? That's really what you need to be doing there. So it could be something like, my core argument is that greater regulation of X technology is required. Or you could put something like, covert surveillance should be banned except where a licensed investigator uses it. Or a right to privacy should be legislated in relation to the following types of technologies or their use in the following circumstances. So, something short and sweet. Now, note that you may have a core argument that contains more than 1 point, and that's perfectly fine. So if you've got a series of points that you'll be making, that's absolutely fine. But again, try and condense it down to a couple of sentences. And then we've got key areas of discussion. So at this point, as much as you are able to, you need to start organizing your discussions. So think about how you might logically structure your paper. If you can, try and identify what headings may feature. Now, you can change those later. Again, you've got to be flexible here, but if you can just start with some headings, it will help you organize material, because then you can take your arguments and you can say that argument belongs under that heading with that source. That argument belongs under a subsequent heading with another source. So things to think about when you're identifying your key areas of discussion, other than obviously the law on privacy in relation to that technology or the circumstances in which it's used. But other things you can think about are whether there are jurisdictional issues or multiple agencies involved, and that does or will interfere with the smooth operation of the particular area. You can look at practical problems that are caused by that, or whether that might present a barrier to law reform and how it might be overcome. You could look at another jurisdiction, so material from the USA or the UK or Canada. And the great thing about some of the stuff that you guys might be looking at is that some of those countries have proceeded with certain types of technology in certain circumstances. So they could be providing you with examples of what works well or what not to do. So, and there's nothing wrong with citing those materials. It's not like a problem question where we go, you can only cite cases and statutes and it has to be from the relevant jurisdiction. This is really about you gathering evidence to support a key argument. It doesn't matter where that evidence comes from as such, as long as it's a suitable source. So, for example, what I mean by that is you must evaluate that material when you are writing about it, when you're reading and researching it, and when you're writing about it. Let me give you an example. You could be looking at, say, CCTV in schools, and look at the USA and find that they've got CCTV everywhere in schools. But the context is different there because they have a huge gun crime problem and lots of terrible school shootings, whereas in Australia we don't have that problem. And so to some degree, that material is helpful and it informs strategy and policy, but we can't just replicate what's been done in the USA because the context is different. So you really need to weigh the source, evaluate it, consider its context if you're looking at material from another jurisdiction. It's also important to obviously provide an overview of the information that you've gathered so far. So where you're making a particular point, if you've got a source already on that point, note it down in the project plan. If you don't, again, put in brackets, need to locate suitable source. Okay, so that it's clear to you when you look at the plan, so it's clear to you as well as me, what research you've got supporting your key arguments and where you need to still do a bit more work. It's going to help you plan what future research you need to do over the coming weeks. Now, if you have read those sources in detail, you could start to compile it a little bit like a lit review, which I talked about in last week's workshop, which is basically the citation of the source and then a summary of the main points. So that should be short. It should be the key things that come out of that source. You don't want to basically write out the source again, or even just cutting it in half is still way too large. You need a couple of lines or dot points that reflect the key points that come out of that source. So if you can do that. Again, that's going to help you later on, because when you start the drafting process and you think, oh, I need a source for that, you can scan read your lit review and go, yeah, that's really useful, I'll use that one. So as I say, it's great to kind of put that level of detail in. So headings, key arguments under the headings, sources that you have gathered so far that support those particular arguments, or identify the missing information that you need to collect in the future. And then think about moving forward, what barriers, so practical and legal problems your project faces in terms of if you recommend change, actually going ahead and implementing it. And then finally, part B, so you need your time schedule. So your plan for the remaining time this term. How much time do you realistically have when you've got your family commitments, your work commitments, your social or volunteer or sporting commitments? How many units are you studying? Once you boil it down, have a look at how much time you've got left. You still need to allow a little bit of time for doing your weekly activities in this unit, but you really need to identify how much time you've got per week and then how much time you've got over the remainder of the term, so that you can then start to allocate your planning, researching, reading, writing, editing and proofreading stages. Now, on the slide there, you can see I've written key questions or issues. That's not a replication of what comes under your project analysis. That's your key research questions. So things that you need to find out in order to be able to understand the field or gather enough sources. And that will inform your search strategy. So what databases are you going to look at? What websites? And by that I mean more than just legal databases and websites. You've got government websites, UN website, international organization websites. There might be a range of advocacy groups that you can look at depending on your topic as well. And then when we say databases, not just legal databases, but secondary source databases for interdisciplinary sources, like Hein Online, for example. And then think very carefully within that about the types of sources that you will be including when you search. So primary and secondary, interdisciplinary sources, whether you need data as well, and try and make a list of those. Now, obviously you can't say I'm looking for a source called the following. Really you're just trying to identify themes that you'll be looking for in your search. And so that obviously informs your search terms. What keywords or search terms will you be using when you're searching for material on the legal databases and the interdisciplinary databases? You could actually split this area into two, so things that you've already found and things that you still need to look up. If you want to, you don't have to do that. And when you're looking at the types of sources, as I've said, remember that all sources are welcome, whether they're from other jurisdictions or interdisciplinary sources. So for example, if you were looking at tracking apps in relation to domestic violence, you might actually want to look at some of the work from psychologists and social workers on stalking in a DV context. Data would also be important there because it provides context for this very wicked problem that society faces and the likely effectiveness of a possible range of measures. So really, explore lots of different sources. Don't just stick to the legal ones, because in many cases you won't find that much. There's not that much on privacy generally, and some of the technology is more regulated than others, but as the issues paper notes, there's a real gap in regulation generally in this emerging technology area. And then finally, organization and storage of the materials. So we talked about this last week, but you need to keep track of what search terms you've used and what databases you've looked at, so that you don't go back and perform that same search on the same database 2 weeks later. You need to keep track of what papers you have found, so that if you come across that paper in another database, you don't download it again and have 2 copies. And you need a method of identifying how you will take research from a particular source and then go and locate that. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're reading a journal paper and it's got some really helpful articles listed in there that you've not yet found. How are you going to make sure that you follow up on that and go and find those articles? You also need to think about where or how you're going to store what you've downloaded. Think about organizing your file system on your computer, for example. And when it comes to the drafting process, it's a good idea to keep versions of the draft, because then if you decide you don't like something, you can go back to the previous version. But that means you need a file name system so that you don't start looking up or writing about something in an old version rather than the most current one. So you need to be able to locate the most recent draft easily. Okay, so let me just stop sharing, because that's enough of me talking to a blank screen. So do we have any questions or comments about what we were just looking at there in terms of the project plan? Okay, Wendy, I can see that you're talking, but we can't hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, I was just inquiring about the primary sources. So I've done a fair bit of reading, and like you indicated before, there wasn't a lot of cases for invasion of privacy. So I don't think I could find hardly any for domestic violence, not in the way that I want to use it. So would you just rely on regulations as your primary source?
Yeah, so in that instance, I think you need to go and look at other ways that privacy is protected, although it's implied or implicit. So you have the right to privacy and the protection of your privacy, but then you also have indirect means of protecting that, if that makes sense. So in the domestic violence context, it would be obviously that there are criminal offences in relation to things like harassment and stalking and things like that. And of course, you've got the DVO orders as well. So you would then talk about how they can indirectly be used to protect an individual's privacy, where an ex-partner is stood outside the house watching them 6 hours a day or whatever it happens to be. But that's just for you to then analyze that. Is it acceptable that we don't have a right to privacy in the first place, and that we only have these indirect means of protecting people in that context? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, I knew that there was protection and so forth, but it's usually after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's also dependent on law enforcement and the relevant agencies being willing to act. But of course, there's that gap there as well. So, yeah, when the conduct is not characterized as criminal yet, but it still is an invasion for the relevant individual. What else have we got here? Stephanie says, I do different versions of drafts and date them. That works well. Yeah, so that's definitely one way to do it, is to put the date that that you've finished that draft, so that then you know at what point in time you've got each draft. Rebecca says, I have a drafts folder inside my subject folder and I number them. Yep, so you can do draft version, you can put V1, V2, whatever works for you, but you do need to have, there will be times when you think, oh, I deleted that and now I really wish I'd got that, and you've got to go back to an earlier draft to find it.
Nicole,
yeah.
Nicole, may I just ask a question?
Sure.
When we use the expression about having a right to privacy, do we mean by that we only have a right to privacy if it's conferred upon us by legislation?
Yeah, so I mean that's another thing, and it's touched on in the issues paper. So under the convention on under the relevant UN conventions, there's a right to private family life, or family life and private life. That is not articulated into law in Australia. In some jurisdictions it is. So in Europe, the European Convention on Human Rights is implemented into domestic legislation. So that's the starting point. There's no general right to privacy because it's not been implemented into domestic legislation. But then it's also, what do we mean by privacy? We all talk about having a right to privacy, but you can also explore the fact that what does that mean? You've got different variations of privacy across different jurisdictions around the world. So for example, in the UK, you can obtain an injunction to prevent someone from publishing information about your private life. And so lots of footballers and celebrities have used that to prevent it going to press that they're having affairs and all of those kind of things. That's not available in every jurisdiction. So there are variations or degrees of privacy depending on the context. So that's something else that you can look at if you've got the word limit, or if that's a central feature of your project. When it comes to Australia, there's some case law that suggests that they're moving towards a recognition of privacy, although what that will look like obviously depends on the way that it's articulated in the case law. But it's underdeveloped, and that in itself is a criticism because nobody knows what it is or what it looks like. And then you can recommend or not recommend, but one of the proposals is to have it legislated. And then on the flip side, some individuals want to do it piecemeal and say, well, we'll do it on the basis of, in this context, your privacy is protected, but there's no absolute overarching right. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, that's. I mean, I've got some difficulties. Just speaking generally about having a right to privacy when in Queensland it's quite restricted.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the jurisdictions vary on that point as well. And that's another, again, if you're focusing on that as a central part of your topic, then you can look at how the various responses in Australia and compare that even to abroad to really get an understanding of what is available and where we might sit within that field of possibilities.
Okay.
Yeah, but that depends on, the problem is you've got to not let it run away with itself, because if you're talking about privacy but in a very specific context, then you don't want to spend 2,500 words, and it could be that size, right? The whole privacy debate. You don't want to spend 2,500 words on that and then have no space for talking about the technology and its particular infiltration into our lives and how that impacts. So it's a balance, and my advice in that situation is, if it's not the central feature of your paper, to work on the other aspects first and at least get a framework for how you're going to work through the technology, the context in which it's used, and all of that kind of information, so that you know roughly what that space is, and then that tells you how much you've got left to explore the privacy debate that you're talking about there. Okay, got some more comments here. Kat, I save everything on my cloud so I don't lose it, and if I find something on my phone, I can just save it and have it later on my PC. I have an Excel spreadsheet set up and use hyperlinks as well. So yeah, so if whatever tools are going to work for you, do it. It might take you a while to find that though. So sometimes, when I first started out with my PhD, I found that I started by just doing an alphabetical list of the sources by the author name. So, you know, Corbett-Jarvis would be above Daniels or whatever by author name, and I had an alphabetical list of sources so that I could just, when I was on a website, go, have I already got that one? Let me just check. The problem was that then got to be a sort of 30-page list, and I went, I can't keep up with all of this now. So at that point, I switched to using some software to help me do that with tags and all of that kind of stuff. So you've got to find what works for you. Now, you're not going to have the problem with the volume that I just talked about, but you have got to find a system that works for you so that it's easy to access the information that you need, and so that you feel comfortable in locating the materials and understanding where they sit in your research project. Chan, I save documents in my Google Drive. I've started creating folders to manage my bookmarks, web links for different issues regarding my topic. Okay, good. So already starting to think about how we're going to save the material that we're gathering. Are there any?
Could I put a plug in for EndNote?
Yep.
I was introduced to the software when I enrolled in this course, and spent a bit of time trying to master it. So for me, the plus in EndNote is I only ever type a citation once, and it's got quite a good filing system for folders. So if I attach a document to the citation, I can also save it in a folder that's easily accessible when I'm working through a project. So it's a pretty good provision that the university has made.
Yeah, absolutely. So EndNote is what I use as well. So EndNote should be, so all of the Microsoft tools should be available for you guys in the CQ Uni portal area for you to download. If it's not, have a chat to TASAC, but certainly EndNote is what a lot of academics use, because as Ivan just said, you just put the citation in once, but you can also store the document that you've downloaded. It's all connected together, and that means that it's easy to locate when you do a search, and you can reopen it at ease. It's really quite useful. It's a little bit awkward to use. I certainly had to watch their how-to videos to get used to make it work properly for me. I had to watch the how-to videos. So if you're going to use that, do set aside, an hour to work through it, and just, keep experimenting with it. But it's worth persevering with that one. Okay. Any other questions or comments about what we ran through, particularly in relation to part A? So I think most of you have started to think about strategy, and you seem to be thinking about the part B side, whether it's your timelines or how you're going to store the information. But what about the part A?
One of the things I find challenging about the project is that oftentimes new thoughts and directions actually come in the writing and the thinking. So I gotta try and I appreciate the need to do a plan, but I don't want to preclude new insights coming in wrestling with the materials and writing about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's actually part of the journey. So hopefully you'll, you know, if I recommend some changes, then you'll adapt your research project anyway after I've looked at your project plan. But also, as you say, you know, when you're reading and writing, suddenly it occurs to you that you need more information on something, or actually that you need that this argument's quite convincing and you need to go and look at that more, or it needs to be more of a central feature. Sometimes you can identify gaps as well, and you think, oh no, now I need to go and cover that because it makes sense that I talk about this thing as well. And that's all perfectly normal. And in fact, my my PhD thesis, I completely rewrote the thesis aspect of it. So, you know, my central theoretical argument in the final 6 weeks. So, you know, these things don't come together at the beginning and then they're executed really perfectly over a space of, you know, 8 or 10 weeks. So just be flexible. If you have thoughts, make sure you record them somewhere, just so that, because you're likely to forget them because you'll have stuff whirring around your brain, especially if you're doing more than one unit. If you have thoughts, record them somewhere just because they might be useful later on when you're in that writing process or as you're reading. So I don't want you to see the plan as a fixed document. And that's what I was trying to say earlier. It's actually just part of getting you going. So helping you realize how little time you have, but also helping getting you going. Because if you can articulate some structure, not the final structure, but some structure, it's going to help you think, I need sources on this point and that point, and then you're going to go and do that research. So it's just designed to help you get going, really. Okay, what else have we got? We've got, Stephanie, I've been writing out a list of potential key discussion areas on a document, and as I read more, I see how areas can combine and new areas emerge. It's a fluid list that helps me. And that's actually a really good point, which is that try writing now, even though we're only in week 3, try writing now, because that's not going to be the finished product, but it helps you refine the process. And as Stephanie says, new things are emerging for her, but also she's seeing how some areas can be put together. So let me just talk very briefly. I'm just going to share the screen with you for a second. Talk very briefly about time planning. So as I've said, start writing now. Now that doesn't make sense when you look at time planning as a linear thing. There are 5 stages: planning, researching, reading, drafting, proofreading, and editing. The drafting comes at number 4. If you were to approach it in a linear fashion, then you wouldn't start drafting until week 9 or week 8 or something like that. But it's really important that you see these as fluid. So you can be researching and reading at the same time. And you may even find that when you're reading that you realize that you need to go and do research in another area, or you need to go and look up some other sources. You can be drafting right now as you're taking notes on what you're reading. So they are actually fluid. Having said that, you do need a schedule. But what I mean when I say schedule, I don't mean, okay, so weeks 1 to 4 are going to be planning, weeks 4 to 6 are going to be researching, weeks 6 to 8 are going to be reading, weeks 8 to 10 are going to be drafting. I don't mean compartmentalize it in that way. All that the schedule is doing is identifying when you have to, at the latest date, stop a particular stage. So, you know, if you don't put that you're going to stop researching at week 6, you could still be doing it in week 11 and have not written anything yet. So it's really important to identify when a stage must naturally come to a conclusion because you're running out of time. Okay, but that doesn't mean that you can't be doing researching and drafting at the same time, or doing reading and researching at the same time. It just means that the research process has to stop at this point. And I absolutely have to stop drafting in week 11 because I've got to have a week to proofread and edit. Does that make sense? I'll stop sharing and come back to you. So I want you to try and see it not as definitive time periods that are isolated from each other, but just as markers for you to stay on track, so that this is the easiest thing to do, is to research because you're interested in the topic, or because you fear the writing process. It's easier to research and read than it is to write. And so you just do that nonstop, and then you get to week 10 and go, oh no, now I'm going to have to produce my paper in 2 weeks. And it's not, even though you've done all that research, the paper itself won't reflect the research because you haven't got the proper amount of time to work through the material. So as I say, just have a schedule of when things naturally have to move on to the next stage, but be fluid. And I really recommend writing as soon as you can. It helps refine the process. You probably won't keep anything that you write over the next 5 weeks, but or you'll only take bits of it, but it's really helping you understand the flow of your arguments, what's missing, what you have that works well, and where the gaps are in what you've got so far. Okay, any questions about that? No? Okay, so Chan says, how do you determine the best questions to ask based on the research you have done so far? Not quite sure what you mean by that, Chan. Do you want to explain what you mean? So you've got your research that you've done so far.
Yep. Sorry. Nicola, so just based on part A, where it's the key questions or the key elements that's part of your argument, just as part of the project plan. I just want to know, like, how do you determine the best questions to ask, like based on your research? You know, for example, like I've seen that with face recognition, there's actually no legislation regarding face recognition at the moment. So things like that, like how to assess what to ask. Like, I mean, that's one piece of information I've seen so far. And, you know, I've seen that there are regulations like overseas in the US. Yeah, so I'm just trying to figure out like what questions I can ask.
Yep. Okay. So
to prepare. Yeah.
I guess, and it's really topic dependent, but you should always be asking the law question. So, you know, is this area regulated, firstly, or is it impliedly or indirectly regulated? So even if you haven't got facial recognition software specifically regulated, does it fall within CCTV, for example? Is it regarded as CCTV? You can also draw an analogy with CCTV there anyway. You know, this legislation could be extended to cover facial recognition software, but is it appropriate? So your question there is, what existing regime exists? If the answer is none, what existing regime covers this type of technology in some form, and is that suitable? And then you can then move to another jurisdiction like the US, where they've got some regulation across some of the states there. So you could then say, how is this regulated in other jurisdictions? Is this a suitable method? What are the practical problems or benefits with the way that it's been regulated? So
part A like acts as a guide to the research process.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you can identify the key things that you want to look at, you can then work out what sources you've got and what sources you need for those key things. So, you know, it then stops you just doing a blank search on facial recognition and then getting, I imagine, quite a lot of hits if you do that. Even though there's not much law on it, if you type that into an interdisciplinary search database, you'd get all the IT stuff on that, you'd get all the, you know, sociology stuff and crime and all of that kind of stuff. So so it's about really trying to refine what you're looking for, because then that will inform the research process.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, what else have we got? I've placed key questions on each branch of my mind mapping. It is quite challenging to stay in line with the scope of the research. Yeah, absolutely. So your mind map can really help here because it obviously everybody knows we've got to look at the legal databases. You probably know you've got to look at the interdisciplinary ones, but your stakeholder map and your mind map might help you identify other areas where you can find information like advocacy groups or government departments and things like that. And then also you can start to think about what opinions they might have and whether or not they're useful for your discussions. So those particular stakeholders might have a particular viewpoint. Is that useful for your discussions? Could that be incorporated into a particular heading or a particular area of your research? So very useful for really helping you think broadly about how to structure your research. Any other comments or questions? I know that this is an area where there's not a lot of law, and it feels kind of worrying, I think, when we're so used to that process of problem questions of going, for every time I tell you what the law is, I need to provide you with an authority before I apply it. You know, that's it's so entrenched in what we do. It feels really funny to step outside of that process. And even if you've done essay questions before in other units, it's normally featured around a particular law or a series of laws. So you've got something to work with, and so it feels really uncomfortable doing it in this context where, firstly, it's an area of the law that you've not really looked at before or you've glanced at through tort or criminal law. But secondly, there's actually not that much out there. I mean, the issues paper says that. So in Queensland anyway. So it feels really uncomfortable. But you're not here to tell me what the law is, really. You're here to analyze the law or the absence of it. So you're critiquing the fact that there are these gaps all over the place and we're not prepared for this new technology. So we've got the overarching debate of should we have a right to privacy? And then from that, you know, filters down the in what circumstances do we have a right to privacy? Can that be trumped or balanced against public safety and public interest and all of those kind of things? There's that overarching debate. But then there's also that debate of what should it look like? How should it operate in relation to specific instances, so specific contexts or particular technologies as well? And at the moment, there's just gaps everywhere for these new emerging technologies. So it's okay to say that this area is not regulated or there's very little regulation, and it's okay to look to other jurisdictions, and it's okay to identify key things that you think are required moving forward. It's just part of the analysis process. You're being graded on your analysis of the law or lack of law, or the piecemeal effect of the law. Any other questions? Okay, well, I can't stress to you how useful it is having someone in the same topic as you that knows a little bit about the sources that you're looking at to discuss things with. So if you haven't done so, please post your research topic onto either the forum or in the Moodle Teams area, just so that you can find like-minded people. Next week, we will be looking at rules, and by that we mean legislation and regulations and those kinds of things. So next week, we need to locate some legislation and update it. So that's part of the process of checking your basic research skills in that area. Now, I've done a little quiz, like a quick quiz. It's really short. I think it's only got 3 questions in it. It's like, it might be 5, I'm not sure. It's got a diagnostic, it's a diagnostic quiz. It doesn't count towards anything, but it's just a flag to you if you need to freshen up on your skills in relation to a particular database. Okay, so it may be that you're great on Ostley and you're great on Lexis, but your Westlaw use is a little bit shaky. So that diagnostic quiz will help you identify that. So that's a great resource. If you find that you do need to freshen up on one database, I've also got a link to a series of videos, one for each of the databases, so that you can freshen up those skills in that particular area. Now, where the database provider has their own video, I've just provided a link to their own video. But if they haven't provided their own video, I have created one, so with an example that we're searching for. On top of that, I've also got in there how to note up legislation. So how to identify cases that have talked about specific provisions in legislation and articles that have talked about specific sections in legislation as well. So there's one on Ostley, Lexis, and Westlaw. So have a look at those if you don't know how to do that already. And if you want to freshen up your basic research skills, there's a series of videos in a separate page that you just click on the link, you go through to the page, and then you identify which one you need as well. So lots of resources there for you to use if you feel like you just need to freshen up in those particular areas. If you're still having trouble after you've gone through those basic videos, please feel free to get in touch with me or the librarians. They might be able to help you as well. Okay, any questions about the material for next week? No? Okay, in which case that we're right on time, so I will close the session. So thank you all for attending. You've still got a couple of weeks to work on your project plan, so don't panic yet. But just remember that the more detail you put in there, the more feedback I can give you when I come to marking them. And that's what that exercise is for. It's not really about grading you. It's about providing you with feedback that you can use towards your final project. We had to attach value to it because otherwise you wouldn't do it, and then I wouldn't be able to give you the feedback, but it's really a feedback exercise. So please remember that. And there's no right or wrong way of doing it, but the more detail you include, the more feedback I can give you. Okay, thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next week. Bye.